So I'm going to give you, there's a couple of other talks this afternoon that'll touch on some of the related studies. So we're studying air quality and health impacts in the Salton Sea region, where there appears to be an association between the dusts and the high incidence of childhood asthma. So the project we have is looking at the incidence of asthma in the residents in the region. And we're looking at trying to connect directly the contributions of dust to the lung disease that we see in the residents there. But what I'm going to talk about is how we're working with the community in a number of different projects that are had been started a few years ago, and as well as a few other new ones, and the way in which our community engagement and communications are really an important part of the research. So here's a picture of the team. Again, we're talking about comics today, and so we have a few comic artists that have been involved in the project. Here's a picture of the team, and I of course apologize to Will for not drawing his new beard in there, but you can see the team represented here, and a lot of different labs from across campus have been involved in these studies. So the discussion here is the idea that we're looking at the impact of air quality on health in communities. And so, of course, an important part of this is working with the communities to really identify what the priorities are in the communities, rather than just kind of helicoptering in as, smart PhDs saying we know what the real questions are. So we've actually had a community advisory board, had a lot of conversations, as well as now the outreach has grown a lot larger to conversations with community organizations and other groups all around the Salton Sea. And I'll talk about that toward the end. The part of the communication with the communities has to do with helping them as part of the research team to identify the priority questions affecting health, but also having them help us identify routes in terms of the way our research should go. So it's a two-way conversation. So as we develop better quality research based on the directions that the community has given us, we can provide back information that communities now can use, where they become empowered to engage with agencies and other organizations to be better advocates on their own behalf, as well as helping us do better research on how to address a lot of the health effects. So one of the things I found over the last few years working with these communities is that they really have not had really a strong voice in things like state policies, things like that. Partly because many of them are Mexican immigrants, many are undocumented and don't have the same kind of political weight as some of the more prosperous members in the communities like near Palm Springs. So because of that history of basically being ignored or minimized, they have legitimate reasons to be suspicious of people coming in and trying to do work in the region. This has especially been highlighted because of the new emphasis on lithium extraction in the southern Salton Sea. So the challenge we have is to develop this good relationship with the community, to continue that partnership in the research, and get, part of that exchange is also to help work with them to explain to them and have them not just involved in the research process, but have them understand more about how the research is actually done, how do we get to our conclusions, as well as how the impacts on health can be understood and lead to new research projects as well. So one of the things I'm going to show you is that we're using comics to provide really more effective ways to communicate with the community on not just what are the important priority areas, but also what kinds of perspectives we have on the actual research problems and how the research is actually done. And as you saw this earlier this morning, the use of graphic narratives is really powerful. And here we're trying to do more complex type of communication where the graphic narrative helps transcend these language barriers. So for example, this is just an image that Yuki had done for this comic that we're ready to about to distribute, where it basically starts from some of the basics of lung physiology and how you can see each of the alveolar components in the lung has this kind of personality. Another aspect, of course, is we're concerned about the aerosols in the Salton Sea region and trying to illustrate the idea that our data begin to suggest that some of the components that are actually in the aerosols are nasty little critters that may be responsible for some of the effects in the health in the community. So rather than just viewing as inert little dust, sand particles and things like that, there actually may be more active toxic components that are in the dust. The impacts then can be illustrated here. You can see that when we're looking at childhood asthma, the important issue is that the airways are most immediately affected because these toxic components can lead to an inflammatory response, thickening of the airways, clogging with mucus, things like that. And those are the kinds of things that help people understand the health impacts of the aerosols. And then also looking at the ways in which we do the research. So the new chapters that we're working on now with Yushin and Yuki are trying to illustrate the ways in which the actual research is done, and also to provide a little bit more illustration of how we come to understand the health impacts of these aerosols in the lung. So I'm going to just mention real briefly, and you'll see later on this afternoon, that many of the studies we're doing that are based on dust exposures from various sites near the Salton Sea, as you can see, Worcester and Dos Palmas, as well as dust collected further away from the Salton Sea. And what we have been finding is that the exposures lead from dust collected closer to the Salton Sea lead to lung inflammatory responses in the mice that we do the exposures to. And it's given rise to this notion that the retreat of the Salton Sea leads to more playa exposure. And so you can see on that Google Earth image, those two images on the right, that as the Salton Sea retreats, it exposes a lot of the lake bed, the playa, especially at the northern and southern end of the Salton Sea. And we think that that exposed playa may be the source of the toxic material, whereas dust we collected north of Palm Springs does not have the same kind of inflammatory response. So here's kind of an illustration of the idea that maybe the exposed playa is somehow taking up some of the toxic components that may be from the ecosystem in the Salton Sea and pulling it into the dust. So the ongoing work with the communities is focused on communicating a lot of this. As I mentioned, much of this has been through we're working on these series of comic books, but communication also is making sure that we are able to reach out to the different communities. So we're doing a project now with the California Air Resources Board to hold a series of community events. The first one is coming up in June. And we are going to have presentations from various researchers and organizations in the Salton Sea region to discuss what's in the air, what are the health effects, as well as actions that are being taken by organizations in the community. Another thing that we are doing is we have a congressional earmark where one of the major portions, of course, is to follow on the how the dust may have brought up some of the toxins from the ecosystem. But equally importantly is a symptom-based epidemiology survey. So one of the problems with the community trying to advocate is that many of the agencies basically say, well, we're not aware of the, magnitude of the problem and things like that. But they also don't want to necessarily find out what the magnitude of the problem is. So our goal is to actually gather the actual clinical data in the communities surrounding the Salton Sea and do a fairly deep epidemiology survey in that region. And then you saw the comics, and now part of the challenge is to distribute the comics. We have them both in English and in Spanish, and we need to hopefully get our first round out into the community, as well as the future chapters explaining what we're working on, and to give a better picture for the community on what kinds of things they need to know, and how they might participate in further research projects. So this is a picture of most of the community organizations that we've been working with. Some of them are on this whole CARB project, as you can see here. And some of the other community organizations. HARC is our nonprofit that we work with a lot of our survey studies. Congressman Vargas up here set aside the earmark funds to help us do some of these studies on the playa and the epidemiology. We also have the Alianza and Comité community organizations, and we also have been working with the other organizations. That we have the Torres Martinez and 29 Palms Indian tribal groups as well working, because they are all directly impacted by these effects here. So again, final cartoon illustrating the effect of drought and climate change, and basically hopefully we can take identify the issues and take action before we all get boiled to death. So okay, I'm going to stop here. Okay, any questions? Oh, here's one, Erica. Okay, process like creating the comic. The story, actually we're giving a presentation on this at the Graphic Medicine conference coming up. What we did was we worked with a whole classroom of artists, and what we did was it's kind of like an iterative process. We presented the project to this classroom of students who are art students, and we gave them the opportunity to each come up with a story to tell. And they all each had a different way of identifying with that problem and saying, this is the story we want to tell. And as each of the student artists develop a comic, basically, we provided feedback saying, well, this is, to be more biologically correct, we would say this, or when, in some that we're talking about the ecosystem or some of the other kinds of things, giving feedback on refining the narrative. And of course, the teachers of the art class were also working with the students in refining the artistic illustrative aspects of this as well. And then finally, as we got further toward a final comic, we selected finally to work with Yushin and Yuki, who had really good narrative stories as well as great illustrations, to develop into an actual book, which we are, then worked with people in the community to make sure that our translations, for example, actually were appropriate, because, there are like many different versions of Salton Sea in Spanish, and some of them are just poor translations, and some of them are in regular use by people who live in the region, and so on. So those are the kinds of things that were part of that process, to make sure that not only are we communicating issues that are of importance and are priority to the community, but also using the language that they use. Okay, benefits of transition to more participatory research. Well, actually, one good illustration of that is Emma Aronson's group has been collecting dust at different sites near in and around the Salton Sea. And in her conversations with the Community Advisory Board, was very useful because they could point to areas where they felt it was more important to collect dust that may be more indicative of where the impact is on the health. These are the communities that are affected. This is where, I don't know, Emma, do you want to speak to that? Well, I see your face there.
Sure. Just, I think you were representing the process pretty well, where really we're able to use participation in the community. And Cheney put together with some of the promotorists that we've been working with a survey, and we were able to get responses about where the community would like to see a lot of the dust collection taking place. Where are the community members interested in those answers coming from? Not just where do we as scientists want to find out those answers of what's going on in the dust. And so then we were able to respond and find locations for dust collectors. And it was interesting because then we iterated back to the community. We asked, do you know anyone who has a location that would be suitable for these dust collectors? And we kind of explained what our needs were. And the community came back and had solutions for us as scientists. So we were able to use some locations. One is a land owned by a community member that was offered to us for this purpose for a while. Another is actually part of a community center / church where they had some land that we were able to use as well. So we just felt, we were able to both learn from the community and also really work back and forth, participate back and forth with them in the process. So it's been very rewarding, I have to say.
I'll give you another aspect of the story is that, there's a more conventional view of what childhood asthma is like and the set of symptoms that go along with it. When we talk to these families with asthma, we learned a couple of things, is that the range of symptoms that they associate with asthma often don't fall into the conventional category of what a pediatrician might ask about asthma. So that's why we want to do a real symptom-based survey to broaden the list of questions that might be connected to symptoms, because it may be, we suspect from the studies we're doing, is that this may not be your conventional asthma, and the spectrum of symptoms and associated events and environments and things like that may really change our picture of what we think the disease is. The other thing is that we learned from these conversations is that many people are relying on the existing epidemiology, which is not very deep. And they're saying, oh, well, the incidence doesn't seem to be that high, hospital admissions and so on. And we discovered that a lot of the families basically go to Mexico for inhalers. They don't bother getting a diagnosis from physicians in the region. Many of them are undocumented and don't have insurance, and that's a lot of why they go visit family in Mexico and basically self-medicate. So a lot of the existing epidemiology data is missing an important part of the community that would actually change the impression of what the actual incidence of asthma may be. Those are the kinds of things where it makes a real difference to have those conversations with the families. I see a question here about medical students, and we have had medical students involved in the project at different aspects, and it really depends on where we are in the research and the types of things that we're doing. So, our next phase when we're doing the epidemiology study, I think we're going to be pulling in some help with some researchers on that aspect. There's more diverse projects that are growing out of the things as we learn. So it's a little bit unpredictable to say what's going to happen, next week or in a few months from now. But definitely they run the range of lab studies to community-based studies and analysis, geospatial mapping analysis. Things like that. So I have one or maybe two medical students coming into the lab this summer to help with some of the projects.